Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On a hot summer day in 2010, 30-year-old Ben McDaniel set out for Vortex Spring in Florida. His interest in diving since childhood had earned him the nickname Waterman among his school friends. With a growing passion for diving, he completed his schooling at a young age and began diving training. He had gained experience in open water diving, but cave diving always seemed like an alluring yet dangerous adventure. Places like Vortex Spring were popular with both professional divers and adventure seekers. However, he didn't have the certification required for cave diving. Nevertheless, Ben felt confident enough in his abilities and was determined to explore the mysterious cave system at Vortex Spring that morning. Ben arrived early at Vortex Spring, prepared his diving equipment and tanks, and got ready to dive. Under the high humidity and heat, the sky was clear and the air was stifling. It didn't take long to fill the tanks and complete preparations. The weather conditions were perfect for diving, and Ben was extremely excited. A while back, during his online research, he had read about the impressive cave system here. However, at that time, he didn't think it was necessary to be an experienced diver to enter. To him, the dive seemed more like an exploration. When he arrived at the dive site, Ben took a moment to look around before stepping into the underwater world. Vortex Spring was a deep, mysterious place, showcasing the magic of the crystal-clear waters. However, Mark, a diving instructor who had previously dived here, had reminded him several times to be careful. Ben also had an emotional side. He always loved pushing boundaries, and stepping into the dark caves of Vortex Spring felt like a new challenge. After preparing his tanks, he donned his diving suit and slowly submerged into the water. The cold waters of Vortex Spring enveloped him in a dizzying embrace. With the comfort of his diving suit and the peaceful sound of the water, Ben felt like he was in another world. The dive quickly deepened, and he moved away from the shallows, approaching the entrance of the cave system. Although the waters of Vortex Spring were clear, the dark magic of the underwater world reminded him how everything could disappear. An instant, after a while, Sarah, a dive assistant, last saw Ben. She had been near the surface, filling the tanks of the divers, when she noticed Ben heading toward the cave. The entrance to the cave was narrow and dangerous. She had warned him several times, saying, "You shouldn't go in there. It's very deep and complicated." But Ben was confident in his decision. Sarah warned him once more, but Ben simply nodded and said, "Don't worry, I'll be fine," and slowly descended into the depths. After that, Sarah only saw Ben dive underwater. Several minutes passed, but nothing happened. Ben had not surfaced. At first, she thought he was just going deeper and would return. However, as time passed, she began to realize something was wrong. Ben didn't return to the surface. In panic, Sarah abandoned the tanks and rushed to the surface, checking the diving equipment. In disbelief, she murmured, "No way." She realized that Ben was missing. A call was made announcing that Ben had gone missing. Other divers around Vortex Spring immediately took action. Rescue teams soon began heading toward the cave system. However, as soon as the search began, they realized something was wrong. The waters of Vortex Spring's deep caves, while clear, were an extremely dangerous place. Ben's disappearance revealed once again the most terrifying truth of underwater caves. Cave diving was only something experienced divers should attempt, and losing everything could happen in just a moment. Sarah and the other divers combed the area where Ben had gone missing, but the complex tunnels and passages of the underwater cave were so deep that no one could find where Ben had gone. As time passed, hope for finding a missing diver dwindled. However, the realization that Ben was truly gone sent everyone into even more panic. No equipment, no trace, and no remnants were found. From the moment Ben McDaniel disappeared, a mystery remained in the depths of Vortex Spring's waters. Ben had vanished into the mysterious waters of the cave with his last step, leaving only questions behind. No one would ever truly know what happened. Ben McDaniel's disappearance was noticed later that day. It had all started as a routine dive day. But by evening, when he still hadn't returned, those around him began to grow concerned. Vortex Spring was typically busy on weekends, but There weren't many divers that day. Ben was supposed to return at the expected time, but there were no messages or calls from him. The team members and other divers started waiting, thinking that he had surfaced after the dive. The next day, a group of park workers noticed that Ben's truck was still parked in the lot. When they looked around, it became clear that Ben had not surfaced from the water, and something had to be wrong. The only things inside the truck stood out: his wallet, phone, and dog. These were the biggest signs that he had never resurfaced. From the water, his phone, although not submerged, was left in the car. His wallet, with all his important documents, was still resting on the seat. His dog, upon realizing that Ben had not returned home, knew something was wrong. The absence of his return had caused a growing sense of fear. Authorities were immediately notified. The Florida police and diving rescue teams arrived at the scene. Nearby divers, upon learning about the situation, had conducted night dives, but still, no trace of Ben was found. His disappearance was becoming more terrifying with each passing minute. The first teams that arrived found no trace or clue. A trained and experienced team was needed for Vortex Springs depths. Expert cave divers were called in, and they began to explore the cave's narrowest and darkest corners. These types of dives were extremely dangerous and could only be carried out by trained divers. However, the area where Ben had disappeared during his cave dive was highly complex. The divers began searching the cave's narrow tunnels one by one. During these difficult searches, no one was able to find the point where Ben had gone missing. The darkness of the underwater tunnels had erased any signs of an exit. As each diver proceeded with a chilling sense of urgency, the way back became more dangerous. As they descended deeper into the cave, it became increasingly difficult to trace the missing Ben's steps. No diving mask, no tanks, and no personal belongings, nothing was found. Normally, if a diver went missing, their equipment would remain somewhere in the cave, but there was nothing. Initially, the divers had only planned to descend for a short time and surface again. But as time passed and the depth of Ben's disappearance grew, it became clear how complex the situation was. No clues had been left behind. Normally, when a diver went missing, they would leave something behind: a mask, a tank, a piece of clothing. But nothing was left. The rescue teams, checking the equipment, continued to dive into the area where Ben had last been, but they found no remnants. As the hours passed since the day of Ben's disappearance, hope for finding him continued to dwindle. In the immediate investigation, none of the other divers remembered seeing anything unusual about his disappearance. A man, whom they were sure had been underwater just a few hours ago, had suddenly vanished. The last diver who saw Ben said he had been moving forward confidently and safely, but they had not seen him again. After a while, the search area was expanded, but still no leads were found. Some divers continued to enter the narrow corners of the cave, but still no trace was found. The majority of the cave system was very deep and narrow, making it difficult for the teams. Normally, when a diver goes missing, something is found. In the search areas, however, at the point where Ben had disappeared, no body or equipment remnants were discovered. With each passing hour, the chances of finding the missing diver grew slimmer. The rescue teams continued to search the area. One by one, however, the cave's mysterious structure and depth made Ben's disappearance even more perplexing. This disappearance deeply shook not just the local diving community, but the entire diving world. Ben, who had left no trace behind, was a man who needed to be found immediately. Yet, no matter how much effort was put in, there was nothing. Ben. McDaniel's disappearance not only shook the diving community at Vortex Spring, but also the entire country. Environmentally conscious divers knew that such disappearances were rare, but the circumstances of Ben's disappearance made the situation even more terrifying. Cave diving was considered one of the most dangerous and complex types of diving. Worldwide, and the cave where Ben had disappeared was both narrow and extremely complicated. Ben was not an expert. However, his courage and desire to explore had driven him deeper, and somehow he vanished. So, what happened in those depths? As soon as news of Ben's disappearance spread, search efforts intensified. The most experienced divers from Vortex Spring decided to dive into the darkest corners of the cave system. Cave diving can turn into a struggle so difficult that a diver might completely disappear. But the fact that no trace was found after such a long period of time only made the events more mysterious. A large team continued their research, exploring tunnels, narrow passages, and the deep areas of the cave. Over time, the teams advanced to the most dangerous parts of the cave. For most divers, entering this area meant risking their lives. However, even the experienced cave divers could not proceed any further. Some divers were forced to turn back after exploring the dark corners of the underwater cave, sometimes for several hundred meters, without finding anything. If Ben had been trapped in those deep waters, he should have left some trace, but not a single piece was found. No items, no clothing, and no diving equipment. Only the empty space underwater, growing more intriguing with each passing second. A few days later, one of the rescue divers who had descended to search for Ben, unfortunately, did not return. The diver had gotten lost at some point in the depths of the cave during the search. The team, taking every risk, continued their search in the depths, but unfortunately, another diver was lost. This tragic loss severely impacted everyone's morale. The search had become more dangerous, and the second loss, just days after Ben's disappearance, had put the rescue teams in a difficult position. These operations in the dark cave system had not only been aimed at finding Ben, but had also put the divers' own lives at risk. The place where Ben had gone missing was already a narrow and difficult area, making the team's work even harder. Even the most experienced divers were struggling in some places, and progressing through many tunnels and passages had become nearly impossible. In the deep tunnels, oxygen tanks were running out, and the underwater pressure was testing the limits of the human body. Every day, a group of divers diving into another part of the cave where Ben had gone missing would disappear into the dark corridors before returning. Then the feared happened. The authorities at Vortex Spring decided to halt further search efforts. The entire operation was officially stopped because, despite all the effort, the missing person could not be found. This decision divided the diving community. On one side, there were those who believed that Ben was still alive somewhere, and on the other side, those who argued that continuing the search was pointless and that a missing person could no longer be alive. However, Ben's family insisted that the search should continue. After Ben's disappearance, his family formed their own private team to continue the investigation. These teams began re-examining different areas of Vortex Spring. However, for a long time, no new clues emerged. The analysis of the search areas revealed that the cave's depths were much more complex and dangerous than anticipated. Yet, no one could understand why Ben had left no trace at the place where he went missing. After the renewed searches yielded no results, Ben's family began to consider legal action in order to further investigate the disappearance and the case. Many questions remained unanswered. If Ben was still trapped somewhere in the cave, why had he left no trace? If he had survived underwater, how could such a survival miracle have occurred? Nothing was certain. The lack of clues left behind by the missing diver was causing growing frustration for each investigator. As time passed, the likelihood of finding the missing person continued to decrease, but there was still hope. However, that hope was beginning to fade with each passing day. Even though months had passed since Ben McDaniel's disappearance, it remained impossible to find any final trace of him. His family could do nothing but continue searching for the missing person, considering every possible scenario. Weeks and months had passed since Ben McDaniel's disappearance, and still no conclusion was reached. The fact that Ben's body had not been found made the situation even more strange. Rescue teams had combed every corner and tunnel, but found no trace. This caused great confusion within the diving community, and over time, several theories began to emerge. Each theory had contradictions, but each also had a strong argument. Ben's disappearance had become not only a physical mystery, but also a psychological maze. First, some people speculated that Ben might have intentionally disappeared. This theory suggested that Ben had consciously surfaced after the dive and deliberately erased his tracks. Rumors spread that he had been going through a period of change in his life, perhaps seeking to leave behind a difficult time. After all, had an adventurous spirit. Diving and exploration gave Ben a sense of meaning. Some people believed that Ben had decided to start a new life by pretending to be missing, planning his own disappearance. Those who supported this theory argued that Ben's lack of any trace after disappearing was evidence that he had intentionally planned his escape. The idea that he deliberately erased his tracks in the dark waters of Vortex Spring and left consciously was seen as a form of seeking freedom. However, Ben's family and close friends strongly opposed this theory. They stated that Ben's character was not suited to do such a thing. He was a family-oriented person, loved spending time with his dogs, and preferred continuing his old life rather than starting a new one. They argued that such a decision was entirely against Ben's nature. Ben's close ones felt there was something else behind his disappearance. His family did not want to see him as someone who escaped, but as someone who had been lost due to an accident or a darker event. Another theory behind Ben's disappearance proposed a much darker scenario. Some people suggested that Ben's disappearance could have been the result of a deliberate murder. This theory began to be debated more as the owner of Vortex Spring, at the time of the disappearance, had a very suspicious criminal past. This past resurfaced after Ben's disappearance. The owner of Vortex Spring was known for some old events linked to crime. Some even claimed that Ben's disappearance after diving was a reflection of this dark past. Those who supported the murder theory argued that Ben was not killed during the dive, but rather after he had surfaced. His relationship with the owner of Vortex Spring and other suspicious individuals led some to believe that Ben's disappearance might have been the result of a deliberate crime. Given the dangers of cave diving, this theory seemed somewhat more plausible. During cave dives, even if a body goes missing, some physical clues would typically remain. Yet no trace of Ben had been found. The possibility that Ben might have been trapped underwater was being considered as part of the murder theory. However, looking at it from another angle, if Ben really had surfaced and been murdered, how could he have disappeared without leaving any trace? The fact that his body had never been found made the murder theory even more complicated and confusing. The mystery behind Ben's disappearance was becoming increasingly impossible to solve. Whether he had planned his own disappearance or had fallen victim to a murder, no concrete evidence had yet been found to explain the event. The mystery of the missing diver was diving deeper. Despite the different theories that emerged, Ben's family and friends wanted to continue searching. However, as each day passed, it was becoming harder to uncover the truth behind the disappearance. Over time, the mystery of the place where Ben had vanished resonated throughout the diving world and beyond, leaving behind a major question mark. Could Ben's disappearance be a deliberate escape or a horrific crime? No one could give a definite answer to this question. Only the painful weight of a missing man and his family continued. As time passed, the mystery surrounding Ben McDaniel's disappearance deepened. Divers, authorities, private teams, and his family had found no trace in the dark waters of Vortex Spring. The cave system had been explored for years. Every corner, tunnel, and narrow passage had been searched. Yet, despite everything, not a single trace had been found at the place where Ben had disappeared, and this situation only bewildered everyone further. People, unsure of which theory to believe, continued to dive deeper in an attempt to solve the truth behind Ben's disappearance. But unfortunately, the depths were growing more and more shrouded in mystery with each passing day. The cave system at Vortex Spring was extremely dangerous and complex for divers. It was an area only the most experienced cave divers dared to enter. However, on that day, Ben decided to step into these depths. Everyone thought the cave had been thoroughly explored and that the body of a missing person would eventually surface in some way. This was the natural flow seen in most situations encountered by divers during cave dives. If a diver enters a cave and disappears, they are either swept away by the current and eventually surface, or they get stuck in a deep spot and remain stationary. However, Ben's disappearance was anything but typical. Many divers who had previously dived at Vortex Spring had found the bodies of those who had gone missing. So, everyone assumed that Ben would eventually be found, stuck somewhere, and that his body would surface at some point. But as days went by with no trace of Ben, it became clear just how unusual the situation was. While the cave system Ben had entered was challenging and complex, bodies of previous missing divers had typically been found. Yet, losing track of Ben felt like a giant puzzle. Searches continued for years, but no clue about the location where Ben had disappeared could be found. At the time, divers and experts began considering the possibility that he might have been stuck in an undiscovered part of the cave system. But this suggestion was one that even experts specializing in deep underwater caves found difficult to entertain. It was well known that there were no undiscovered sections of the cave system. Every corner had been thoroughly explored. In fact, sometimes there were passages only a few centimeters wide, which could be impossible for a person to enter. Still, the fact that everything had escalated to such a great mystery on the day Ben disappeared left everyone filled with questions. Could Ben really have gotten stuck in an area of the cave system that had never been discovered before? But after years of searching, the lack of any equipment, belongings, or body began to make even experts doubt this theory. After all, the area where Ben had disappeared had been searched multiple times. If he had been trapped there, something should have been left behind. As time passed, Ben's disappearance became a sort of legend in the world of cave diving. The lack of anything being found during the search efforts led to disappointment among both divers and experts. Normally, when a diver goes missing in a cave, their body either surfaces or becomes stuck against the cave walls. However, Ben's disappearance continued to remain shrouded in darkness. This situation caused search teams and theories to doubt whether Ben had actually died in the cave. In particular, the fact that none of Ben's diving equipment was found during searches in the area complicated matters further. It was expected that after a diver went missing, their body would either stay underwater for some time before surfacing or remain stuck in a corner. However, after Ben disappeared, none of these natural processes occurred. Even though every corner of the cave system where Ben had gone missing had been explored, nothing was found. This only strengthened the idea that his disappearance was something far more extraordinary. After many theories and possible explanations, no evidence ever surfaced that could shed light on the truth behind Ben's disappearance. The fact that a body had not been found for such a long time in the cave became part of the great mystery. Over time, Ben's disappearance turned into an unknown. Neither his body nor any other traces were ever found. The place where Ben disappeared began to be spoken of as a legend. No one could say for sure what had happened, but something still remained hidden deep within. Ben McDaniel's disappearance, over time, transformed from the tragic story of a missing diver into one of the greatest mysteries in underwater cave diving history. Whether he died accidentally, intentionally disappeared, or fell victim to murder, the truth behind his disappearance remained unresolved. With each passing year, the unanswered questions and the gaps left behind only deepened the mystery. Since that day, the waters of the cave where Ben vanished held a quiet silence, hiding unspoken pain. Even though years had passed since Ben disappeared, the biggest question still lay in the nature of the disappearance itself. If Ben had died in the cave, why was his body never found? Vortex Spring was a place only experienced divers dared to enter, and the cave system had been carefully explored over the years. Normally, when a diver disappears, their body either surfaces or is carried by the current into the depths. The body could have been wedged against the cave walls or remained stuck in an area reachable by divers. However, Ben's disappearance defied this natural flow of events. During the search, none of Ben's diving equipment was found. This suggested that his disappearance was not an ordinary case, but rather something extraordinary. Divers had searched every corner, tunnel, and narrow passage. Normally, after a long time, a missing body would be found somewhere in the cave system. However, since the day Ben disappeared, nothing was found. In the dark underwater world of Vortex Spring, no trace of Ben's disappearance was left behind. Not a single piece of his body or diving equipment was found. This situation meant that the search teams were chasing not just a missing man, but a mystery. Many people began to think that there might be something else behind Ben's disappearance. Some claimed that Ben had planned his own disappearance and intentionally fled to start a new life. While it was rare for divers to disappear in the deep underwater depths, it was even rarer for someone to vanish without leaving a trace. The idea that Ben had somehow managed to escape the cave system and was pretending to be missing formed in the minds of many. Could Ben's personal struggles at the time have led him to take such a drastic step? However, Ben's family insisted that he would never do such a thing. His family and friends believe that his disappearance was not the result of a planned escape, but rather an entirely unintentional incident. For him, disappearing and leaving his old life behind was a completely foreign concept. Nevertheless, this theory became one of the main assumptions for those trying to understand the story of a missing man. What had been done to make Ben's trail disappear? How realistic could it be for someone to vanish without leaving a trace? The murder theory began to attract more attention as Ben's disappearance continued. At the time, rumors circulated about the Vortex Spring owner's criminal past. These rumors suggested that another person or group might have played a role in Ben's disappearance. If Ben had been murdered, who was the killer? The fact that no trace was left after Ben's disappearance was not enough on its own to uncover the truth beneath the water. Some theories suggested that Ben might have encountered a conflict with others when entering the cave. Alternatively, he could have been ambushed and killed by another diver or a security guard during the dive. Supporters of the murder theory believed that the absence of any trace after Ben's disappearance pointed to a darker conspiracy behind the murder. However, this theory also lacked conclusive evidence. If Ben had been murdered, where could his body be? In dense underwater cave systems like Vortex Spring, the disappearance of a body became even more complex. Caves were sometimes so vast that they could hide a diver's body, or they were so deep that finding a missing person became nearly impossible. However, assuming that a murder had taken place and the killer had intentionally disposed of the body raised a significant question. Ben's disappearance was no ordinary disappearance. Ben's disappearance remained an unsolved puzzle in everyone's minds. In the cave diving community, his mysterious disappearance remained an unforgettable secret. If he really died in the cave, why wasn't his body found? If he fled, how did he vanish without a trace? And if he was murdered, who was the killer and where was his body? These questions persisted for years, but no definitive answer ever emerged. Today, Ben McDaniel's disappearance still represents a mystery. The truth has never been definitively revealed, and over time, the incident has become one of the greatest unsolved cases in underwater diving history. Deep in the cave waters, the secret of the day Ben disappeared remains silent. Neither Ben's body nor any trace explaining the moment he vanished has been found. Everything waits an eternal mystery in the underwater world.